Now for something really different, affectionately termed the Velvet Bulldozer. Natalie Lee and Susan Miller will be joined by our real friends who are participating virtually. I'm changing my words on that. I've been talking about my virtual friends. No, these people are all part of our community that just happen to be participating virtually. Sheila Stephenson and Kevin Sigwart will be talking about PSAP boundaries in a cloud-hosted editing environment. I'm looking forward to this.
I'll sleep. Hey guys, Kevin, are you ready to go? Kevin is acting as our Vanna White.
Yes, I am ready to go.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so my name is Natalie Lee. I'm the Geospatial Data Programs Manager for the Georgia GIO. I'm joined by my boss, Susan Miller, and our colleagues, Sheila Stephenson and Kevin Sigwart. And we are so pleased to present our presentation. And we're going to talk more than just about PSAP boundaries, actually. We're going to talk about our Next-Gen 9-1-1 data program, and specifically our validation and integration portal, which deals with kind of all of those data sets. But before we go into that, we want to show you a little video of Susan and I working in real time. Go ahead.
Right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
Great. So I know you're clapping because you see yourself in every single one of those frames. So you know that we're always going to start and bring the humor. But in all seriousness, a lot of the NG9-1-1 program is about herding cats, and that's really difficult. There are communication aspects of it, which we talked about last time we presented to you guys. And then there are also technology aspects of herding cats. And so you have to balance those parts. So that's kind of what we're going to discuss today in terms of our data program at the state level and our state strategy. So we can forward to the next slide there. Cool. Our program, what we're going to talk about today is kind of how we arrived at the decisions that we made. And we're giving you a joint presentation between us and our partners. And we really feel strongly that the people that help us, our partners, our vendors, and consultants are really a part of our team, and that we feel like we need to integrate them completely into what we do. They're really important to us. So that's why we're joined by the One Spatial team, because they've been instrumental in standing up this process. So you can kind of see everybody that's going to talk to you, but I know we're really short on time. So we're going to start right now by just going over the agenda so we can tell you what we're going to tell you before we tell you it. So we do refer to ourselves as Velvet Bulldozers. And all we mean by that is that we have a sort of, you won't mind that we just renovated part of your data world because you'll love what we're going to do with the place and we're super fun to work with approach to collaboration. So we do kind of like to mess things up a little bit, but we do it in a way that hopefully people actually want to work with us again and see the vision that we are excited to show them. So we'll talk about kind of what we started with. Susan's going to go over that, what it looks like to build a data program in Georgia specifically. And then we'll talk about leveraging that really slick technology with One Spatial and out of the box Esri tools alongside lots of communication, so much communication. So we're also going to touch on what we started with in terms of like the landscape of data, what we considered from other states like Michigan and Minnesota, while configuring our deployment to meet our own needs, all while going from like 0 to 60 acceleration. I know all of you working on the federal grant know what that feels like. To get from minimum viable product to minimum viable product in the span of 2 NSGIC meetings, which is 6 months. So finally, we'll talk about what we're going to do next and how we're going to use this process for other programs.
Hey, Susan Miller, work for Natalie Lee. So you guys have heard us say this before, but we really do believe that a rising tide raises all ships. And that's what we focus on. It's a mantra of ours for building data programs. And we try really hard to be a manifestation of best practices from NSGIC because we were quite late to the game in terms of creating data programs and data frameworks. And so we learn a lot from you guys, and we try to bring that to bear whenever we can within our state. So like I said, we are in the fledgling stages of building out our framework data. And we put ourselves in a position of being in the driver's seat with regard to remotely sensed data. So that's imagery and LiDAR. And then we have been incredibly fortunate that our 911 authority, which is housed in our emergency management agency, is led by a gentleman who very quickly understood that GIS played a major role in NextGen and that he knew nothing about GIS. And so he sought us out, and he has put us in the driver's seat for the state with regard to all NextGen 911 data. So miraculously, we got some more framework things passed to us with addresses and road center lines and several administrative boundaries. And we believe that our next big bites that we're going to take are in the area of parcels and potentially geocoding, geodetic controls, and then also working closely with our Department of Natural Resources on hydrography. So last time Frank introduced us as small and mighty. So we are small and mighty, and our office works every day to raise the tide for Georgia. And when Cy told us that we were a big black data hole for the nation. So we really do let that drive us. So another mantra that we go by is that partnerships are always the key to success, always. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Technology is amazing, but it's only as good as the humans who wield it, right? And so we focus entirely on relationships, and then we bring the tech to bear after those are established. So an example is here on the screen of a migration to NextGen 9-1-1. Let me see it. I forgot what it said. NextGen 9-1-1 relies on seamless statewide geospatial data, and seamless geospatial data relies on state strategies and local control. So we're going to be using technology to go out and work with all 700 of our local governments. And we're going to use technology to roll data up on a regular basis, eventually being a daily roll up. And use that technology to go and partner with data authorities, in this case, our most valuable asset in Georgia, which is our local governments, and allow the data to stay with them, and then just use the tech to roll it up and put it into our format on a daily basis. We're going to be engaging our regional governments in order to do that. Obviously, 700 local governments is a lot. And so I started a program right when I got to Georgia with our Department of Transportation as a proof of concept to bring to bear the regional commissions and improve their GIS capacity as kind of GIS service providers. And so we have established that relationship and those business processes. And so we're going to be putting them in a middle tier there. So basically, we know that any program that we need to build, any data program that we need to build, is all about starting with building and enhancing relationships. We do that both inside of agencies. I cannot tell you how many times Natalie and I have to go into an agency and introduce Department A to Department B. happens every day, all the time. And they don't know what's happening among themselves. And so, you know, you've also heard us say we like to unlock data from data jail in rows and columns and databases and really bring it to bear. And a lot of that has to do with these partnerships that we form, both with our partners within our state and then most importantly with the private sector. And I believe it was Matt yesterday who said in a chat that he needs some kind of filter for the private sector. And if they're not in NSGIC, he doesn't give them, you know, maybe I said the time of day. I don't want to put that in Matt's mouth. But that's a very true statement. And so we have been able to, we've spent the last year doing nothing but procurement and contracting, and we have pulled together an amazing group of private sector partners, and we will be continuing to do that and bringing in more and more of them. And so we're just really thrilled about that. Okay, next slide, please. So like I said, we find ourselves playing the role of educator, change manager, and therapist almost 90% of every day with everybody that we work with. And we, not to brag, but we do that quite well. And it really is part of the velvet bulldozer approach. We will disrupt your landscape, but you're gonna feel really good after we do it. Because we're going to make you more efficient and effective. And we're going to bring to bear the power of geospatial sciences, and it's going to be amazing. And we have yet to be disappointed with that philosophy. It's been very powerful. So basically, part of what we do in our role as therapists is explain to folks that everybody has a part to play. People start getting panicky when they think you're going to take over their turf, right? And we have to go in and explain, no. A well-oiled machine has many, many, many parts, all of which are really critical and important, and they all have to work together in a symbiotic relationship. And so we at the state play a role, but we are one part. You must play the other parts. So basically then, to summarize, our office and our role is really to be a bridge, right? But we need to help people walk across that bridge. And whether we're talking about data, which this slide says, or whether we're talking about application development or business process re-engineering, which is something we do a lot of, we're really here to help take the state from where we are today to the future. And we do that through partnerships. Again, the partnerships are really key. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Nell.
Can forward the slide if you want, Kevin. So I love this comic strip because it applies to so many different things. But in this case, you all know that when you start talking about data programs, everybody's like, yeah, we want data. We want it today, now, and we'll totally work together. I'm sure we can find some common ground. And then you introduce, new people that they have to work with, and new processes they have to learn, and new standards they have to apply, and new applications they have to learn. And there are crickets. So what we have to do is know that every time we roll something out, it better not be brand new or it better be around for a really long time. So we're super careful about pushing things out. So we, at the scale that we're working with, at the state scale, we want to make this as easy as we can within reason and still do the job, but also apply to more than just what we're working on right now, so that we can kind of scale it up and work on something different. If we need to do hydrology tomorrow, it's going to be generally the same thing that they worked on today. If we're going to do roads tomorrow, it's generally going to be the same thing that they did today. And that's really important to us and for us building smart. Another word for that would be making sure that your data processes and your tools are not unitaskers. And I'm going to let Sheila talk to you for a minute about multitaskers and unitaskers.
Helps to unmute. Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, a while back I was having a discussion with Sandy Stroud, the Minnesota 911 program manager, and we were talking about the implementation. And she said, 10 years ago, 911s needed specialized tools because no one really understood the requirements. But today with NINA and all the requirements out there and open and very accessible, it's very clear what the requirements are. And so it reminded me of one of my favorite chefs, Alton Brown, if anybody is into cooking like me. Anyway, he goes on these hilarious rants about unitaskers, which are those things in the kitchen that just clog up your kitchen drawers. And it's things like, as Natalie talked about, her little strawberry destemmer. And when we were talking about it, Kevin said, I have one of those. It's a knife. And so the whole idea is that why utilize a unitasker when there are perfectly good multitaskers? And that's the approach that we've been taking when we implement the 911 systems, is that they can use the one integrate to solve the 911 issues and get all the validations and help with the improvement of data. But then, as Natalie mentioned earlier, then they can move on and what can they help the DOTs with, or what could they do with hydrology and those sorts of things. And that unitasker can be, that multitasker can be utilized to solve those problems as well.
Thanks, Sheila. Exactly. So if we could throw another metaphor at you, if we could identify or describe the ideal data program, we think it would look kind of like this, like a tree. And you have a big, beautiful orchard tree that produces data fruit. And that fruit is dependent on solid, secure tech, reinforced standards, scalability, process, that communication and coordination. All of that leads to this well-maintained, regularly used data that's easy to get to. And like a fruit tree, we have to keep the process pruned and be watching our fruit for issues that might need treatment or retraining or a little bit of help, some more communication. In another 5 years, we'll have so many of these other trees in our orchard. We have to operationalize the maintenance of each one in a really methodical way. So we need the data to be freely accessible and used regularly so that it stays free of disease, and we can refine it over time. So in that way, every data program should be as much of a multitasker in terms of what is being produced and how it is being produced so that it's uniform and dependable. So we would like to know more about your multitasking data. So Kevin is going to open us back up for some conversation about that.
Thanks, Natalie. So as you can see, we have a little Mentimeter poll, and there's going to be 3 questions on that Mentimeter poll. I'm pretty sure people know how to use Mentimeter, but if you don't, you can either go to this URL here, or if you just go to menti.com, you could type in this code, or if you have your cell phone handy, you can also just use this QR code. So there's 3 ways to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and just kick off the Mentimeter. So give me 30 seconds. So we have these 3 questions. If you guys want to start answering them, and we have very limited time, so we might breeze through this.
Kevin, I think they need the QR code back up.
I moved too fast. Sorry about that, everybody. Here we go.
Folks good in the room? Okay, Kevin, I think they're good in the room.
All right.
And I'm sure our online folks are faster.
All right. So we're getting lots of exhausting, interesting.
Slowly improving, but still broken. Nice. Us too, you guys. That's awesome. Okay.
All right. So we'll move on to the next question real quick, and then we can always come back later too after the presentation. If I can figure out how to go next. There we go. The next question was, are you multiplying your program specific funding by creating multitasking data and systems? And I think, it may help to give a little bit of what we actually mean by this, since there's so many unsureds. It's are you you're getting funding for 911 purposes, are you using it to, build an infrastructure to help support, building an ad out the national address database, or helping build out your own spatial data infrastructures? Broadband funding may be coming out, or is coming out, and there's probably gonna be more discussion about this tomorrow, I believe, in a session. Those are just other opportunities. So that's what we mean by that. Now that I explained it, things are shifting a little bit. All right, and then lastly, what are some of your multitasking programs? And this is also, just to keep in mind, this is just to get our minds thinking as Natalie and Susan and myself and Sheila continue on through this presentation.
All right, so keep filling those out, and we'll come back.
We'll come back. Perfect.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so this is our data program tree as we envisioned it a couple of years ago now. Gosh, this is what we thought NG9-1-1 would look like. So the basic idea is we need to collect, validate, and aggregate 159, 163, depending on what you think, entities worth of data into our state data set. So what are the things we need to look for? How are we going to check for congruency between jurisdictions without holding data hostage? Because we need to be able to see data even if it's imperfect. And how would we keep the public up to date on our progress? How are we going to hold ourselves accountable? How are we going to make sure everything's secure? And so we came up with this flow, and it's pretty simple, but each of these boxes we knew we're going to have like whole ecosystems of stuff in them when we went to go build out. And that was what made working with OneSpatial really helpful. We knew that we needed an agnostic solution. We couldn't jump into an NG9-1-1 solution. We didn't really want to either at the beginning. We wanted to be able to kind of build the scaffolding and then kind of use at a different level, use that data mitigation powerhouse from those great NG9-1-1 companies to help us once we had our state strategy kind of worked out. So Kevin, do you want to talk a little bit about how OneSpatial built out some of these boxes?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Natalie. So basically, when at OneSpatial, we have quite a bit of experience dealing with your typical data supply chains, and these are your data roll-up efforts, whether that's at the federal government level, state, or locals. And we typically see the same, very similar paradigms when you're working with collecting data. We find that as data contributors, the data contributors they're using their own technology. They've put investments in software and in systems to support their existing workflows. So as Natalie mentioned earlier, is that what at these state or federal entities want to do is they want to build systems that are not going to disrupt that too much. So, and then keep in mind also that if you're a state collecting data, you also have your own systems and your own investments that you put in. So you also don't want to disrupt that too. So when we build these data supply chains, we're trying to take both of those into account and build a system that can really support that. And we do that through these 6 steps. So one is providing a way for data contributors to submit data in the format of their choice using the technology of their choice for doing the data editing. They can submit the data. It then gets, if the data is managed in a different schema, which is typical because they have their own business processes that they're supporting, you provide a way to easily map the schema from their existing system or their existing data to whatever the person collecting the data should be in. Once they do that schema mapping step, it will run validation checks against that data to make sure that that data is actually fit for purpose for where it's being submitted to. If there are quality issues, and typically when you're first working with it, you're going to have some data quality issues. It's going to return a report in the format that they're using. So they could take that report, that spatial report in the case of GIS data, and bring it into their GIS application of choice. So whatever the GIS software that they're using, whether it's ArcGIS Pro or ArcMap or whatever flavor of ArcGIS Enterprise they're using or other technology, they can bring it into that software application, correct the data, and resubmit it to revalidate it. After going through a series of iterations, getting the data cleaned up, it then gets to a point where it's prepared enough to be submitted. Then it goes through another set of validation checks to make sure it's fit for purpose. It goes into then a change detection process. So when we're doing these data supply chains, what we don't want to do is we don't want to do a simple truncate and load. You want to actually do the change detection process, determine what's different between that data set that was submitted and what is in the central database repository. And then then deal with just those deltas. That way you're going to maintain that rich metadata that has been already building out in your GIS database, or your central database repository, I should say. After that step, you get these series of changes. Now, the next step, when we get to step 4, this is typically, it's an optional step because it really just depends on how complicated the change detection process is. Are you dealing with things that are being edited by multiple data suppliers in the same area? Are they using different scales, things like that? So it can get pretty complicated. So when in those cases, like the previous presenter, the U.S. Census case, there is a proposal review process where there's a confidence score that's associated with each change, and then those changes can be reviewed and then integrated and then marked as accepted or rejected. After that process goes through, those changes then get integrated into the central database repository. Then the last step is whenever you're doing any sort of data supply chain, you have the stream of data coming in from multiple different data suppliers, different organizations, different data sets, and they all have a relationship to each other. So what you want to do after you're going, the data gets through the process, is rerun the validation checks at the central database repository level. In the cases of next generation 9-1-1, you would think about this as like, doing your cross-jurisdictional validation checks, things like that. So this is the general workflow and the methodology that we approach our data supply chains. And this methodology is also what we're doing when we're doing these 9-1-1 implementations, like what we're doing for the state of Georgia. So with that, I'll let Natalie jump and talk a little bit more about what we're doing at Georgia.
That's right. So look, it's me panicking on a call. So to be serious, though, this was us for the past 2 years. We were trying to stay cool while working at breakneck speed to deliver this scaffolding, because we had to take advantage of what we had to work with so that we could be ready for this next stage while COVID was going on. So like Susan mentioned before, we did a lot of researching. We started building with OneSpatial in the spring of 2021 and had a viable product in November. Our dashboards that we talked about are going to be live here pretty soon. Some of them are already live. And we have a production and a dev environment now. And we're about to let people inside. But like I mentioned before, we're really careful about deploying things. We want to make sure they have plenty of user guides and support before we do that. And go to the next slide. So this is how it turned out. And it's really hard to see. I know it's a lot on this slide. I'm going to fly through it. You can find these materials on our website, along with some documentation that will look familiar to what you're seeing on some of these slides. So I want to get to the discussion part of this in case you have questions, but I do want to highlight a couple of areas where we were able to transform the strategy or the plan and design into something useful for our PSAPs and our GIS groups at local government. So you can see, now Kevin and I are going to try to read each other's minds on where I am. Okay, so the first thing is you'll see that standards were really important. We started there. We made sure that we had standards built and that the rules and validations, the schema that we were building into matched what was going to be needed by our wayfinding companies and locals, private sector, partners, other agencies. They all participated in our standards development to make sure that we were supporting the building of data that would actually be useful to them. So our users, our PSAPs and GIS departments, they need an access point that they can get to from anywhere. So they're going to go through our hub. Everything that we do connects to our hub. And there hasn't been a standardized state portal like this until now. So that's what they're getting, is a secure, interoperable option for how to get us their data. And We also have options for working with other programs and systems in the future, including using feature services. There's so much work that has to be done in Georgia. It's going to involve lots of different teams that are going to need to help. So we need to make it possible for anybody, all of those fabulous 911 data mitigation firms we hope to work with in the future, make sure everybody's able to send their awesome data up. So in the spirit of that full and open access, we have to be able to map to our standard without making people adopt it completely. So a lot of people have been using FME to do this and scripting. This is really all it is just being able to map to our schema. So as long as they have the ability to answer or map to the fields that are critical, they can keep whatever schema they have right now. And that's really important because that was the first thing that they were worried about when we did standards development. So remember, we can go to the next slide. Remember that we have such variability between rural and urban, coastal and mountain regions. They have to have utter control over when and how and what they validate. So in our tools, they can validate whenever they need to. Like Kevin mentioned before, or I think it was Susan, eventually it'll be real time as needed, but right now, they can kind of ease into it, which has been great. Next slide. People also need lots of feedback. And that feedback, if it comes in a report, they get kind of frustrated because you just took their geospatial data and you ran a report and gave them a document. So while they do get a report, they also get actual feature data sets that explain to them where their anomalies are so they can zoom right to them and take a look at what might be going on there. So they've been really enjoying that. Our stakeholders have been loving the reports that we've been giving them back. So they can go take that to their vendor, whoever's helping them, their teams, and figure out what's going on and then resubmit when they're ready. So we're trying really hard not to micromanage their process because they don't love that. Next slide. So again, transparency is really important. It's critical to how Susan and I roll. We want everyone to see everything. So we leverage dashboards so that people can see the data and progress over time. We started with a baseline dashboard and now we're deploying data set specific dashboards that give track things like validation results overall, the last validation that was run, change over the last 30 days, and also relative status. So, there's the cold hard facts about where you are in conformance, but then there's how you are relative to your peers. And that's really important for not only giving really bad news at the beginning. So next slide. So like we mentioned, we have to check cross-jurisdictionally. I'm not really going to get into this because I think Kevin covered it pretty well. But we have to be able to kick off validations at the state level so that we can look cross-jurisdictionally. So right now this data becomes available to the back end and then we run it as needed. And we know that in the future, we'll probably need to make that more automated. So there you kind of have it. We actually published the final data. We're really excited to actually participate in the NAD. That will be great. And we know that we have wayfinding companies that, again, we're participating on our standards that are excited to have one place to get some of these data sets. So that's going to be really important. But of course, the most important client is that ESINET, which hasn't been built yet. The RFP hasn't even been posted for the ESINET, but like Susan mentioned, the 911 community really gets that the data is really important. So they're putting a lot of effort into making sure that we are supported there and building out the data. So if we could look into the future, we would have lots of trees in our orchard that would have good data program processes that are not unitaskers. Obviously, all of those aren't going to need one spatial tools, but we're trying to build in a way that if validation and aggregation is needed, that it's something that we can do in a repeated way, and it's really dependable. So an example that Susan mentioned before, this is kind of the parcel workflow where now we're thinking about like other data sets. What do we want to go towards next? So really, I mean, this looks almost identical to what we showed you in the beginning, right? It's just the same general process, sourcing from a local entity to something at the state level. So the rules may change. The rules in that validation workflow where they actually run it, that might change, but the general process of how they interact with us will be very similar. So we can move to discussion.
So hopefully what you saw is we're putting our money where our mouth is in terms of build it once, use it many ways. We're thinking of that in terms of applications as well, not just in terms of data. And so we are really thrilled to have partnered with One Spatial and to build tools that we know we can use many, many ways to support our fledgling data programs. And through that, we will be able to achieve a lot of economies of scale. We've started with nothing. We now have an infrastructure, we have tools, we're starting to build data sets, and we couldn't be happier about it. So that's us. And now we want to hear from you guys. So we'd love to open up do we have time, Frank? Are we good on time? Okay. We tried to keep it tight so we can talk. So we'd love to talk and hear how you guys deal with these things and what is keeping you up at night. And we can take some of these questions, we can tweak them. These are just meant to be conversation starters. So do people have comments?
Marianne, Indiana. I was wondering for the cross-jurisdictional, I know you guys went over it, but kind of quickly, how do you deal with data sets that don't match up at the county boundaries or municipal boundaries or whatever? Or
because they don't ever match up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, just to be clear that none of them match. So there's a long answer to that, but generally we are realizing that the state needs to manage those data sets, that boundary data sets. It really doesn't make sense for everybody to submit a polygon file. That's not going to work. So instead, what we're doing, our approach is going to be with line segments. So each jurisdiction will have a line segment with their neighbor that they have to agree on. And then, yeah, so we're going old school. Remember how we would start with like a line coverage and build?
In ArcInfo?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Right. I remember it was so great. And then we'll just keep all the attributes on the centroid. I just think that go old school on this.
Yep. Let's go back to ArcInfo workstation.
Should we? Yes.
Yeah,
Esri is rolling over right now.
We're also running a series of workshops, boundary reconciliation workshops across the state, and pulling together the stakeholders from fire, EMS, police, and law enforcement, and leaders within those communities. And we're going old school there too. We're taking giant, huge banquet table size maps and putting them out and saying we're locking you in here with pizza till you come to a decision on what your boundaries are.
Jamie, do we have some folks online that have questions?
I do not see any questions at this point. I know that there were a couple requests for sharing the link or the URL to the NextGen 9-1-1 dashboard, Natalie, and getting access to the PSAP boundary through the portal. Those types of questions, but that's it.
Can I ask a question? It's like one per state because this might not work. It's okay. All right. So Megan, Indiana, how do you deal with all of the fruit trees and all of those different data sets? And now you're creating those. Where does authoritative data come in? And that question of who gets to be the authority?
Depends on the data set. So for the, I'll just take addresses and road center lines, the authoritative owner there is local government. And we're just playing the regional governments and the state government is just playing a roll-up role. For things like imagery and LiDAR, we would be the authoritative data set for that. I mean, the authoritative data owner for that. So it'll vary depending on the source, but we'll have, ultimately, I see us having a mix of things that we're rolling up from a local level when appropriate and when that is going to, when that will result in the best possible data. And then in other cases, like with imagery, we'll buy it from others. So did that answer your question? Not so much.
So one thing to note is especially when it comes to the boundary issue, that's why that's so important, having them actually sign off on their boundary. And it's also why change detection and tracking uploads is so important, because and why we built this in Azure Fed Cloud. So this is in the Fed Cloud. We've built it to moderate classification level because we know that we have to be sure that as long as we're holding the data, that it is maintaining its integrity and its security. So we have to balance access with making sure that it's secure. And one of the parts of that data integrity is making sure that every point along the path of it being aggregated, that we are not changing attribution or geometry without the express permission of that local authority. Does that help a little more? Okay.
Doesn't anybody have example of who your cats are and how you herd them? I know you all are cat herders.
Hey, Susan, Susan and Natalie, we had a question come through the chat from Nathan Jones. Shares great presentation. Could you describe the error resolution process?
Yes, okay. So it depends on what you're talking about. If it's address points and center lines, they're getting feedback on where their errors are. And then when they re-upload, if you remember, Kevin talked about that change detection. So at that point, it identifies that there's new information, either attribution or new geometry, and it uses that new data to rerun the validation against what is already existing. So that's one part of it. The second part would be where it is discrepancy between on boundary files. And that's where Susan was talking about. It is an offline, it is not a technological resolution. It is these two entities have an issue, it's classified as an issue, and then there's follow-up between them offline or online to make sure that they agree about where that line, that boundary should be drawn. And that's huge. That's going to take a lot, most of our time, I would say, in the next couple of years.
Yeah, just Neil from Massachusetts is affirming that you got to sort out the boundaries, and it's all about building the relationships in order to herd the cats. And that just takes people time.
Yep, that's great. Let's give it up for the Velvet Bulldozer and their partners, One Spatial.